Well, hello everyone. My name is Jennifer Doctor, and I'm a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. I collaborate with Jose Mestre, who just recently retired from the University of Illinois. So in my broader research interests, I'm interested in problem solving and the role that representations play in the process of problem solving. I think that eye tracking as a technology has a lot of potential to inform this area of research. And Adrienne Madsen did her dissertation research in this area, and she showed that when they were looking at diagrams, people who answered questions correctly were looking at what they called thematically relevant areas of the diagram, whereas people who got it wrong were answering more consistent with the way that novices might answer. This study is going to focus on a specific representation like kinematics graphs and how people view and interpret those graphs. And so I'm not going to review the research that we already know about all the conceptual difficulties that students have with interpreting graphs, but we'll see some of those coming up in the data. I also wanted to highlight that there is a research group in Croatia who has published some studies recently in the last couple of years using eye tracking research, so it's becoming a little bit more popular. This study used an older model of a stationary eye tracker at the University of Illinois. It's called a Tobii system. And that just means stationary means that it's not mounted on your head or anything like that. You're just looking at a computer screen, and then it uses a couple of optical methods in order to record some data. And so there's a webcam that looks for the contrast between the dark and the white parts of your eye in order to find where your center of your pupil is. And then it uses infrared beams in order to create something called a bright pupil effect. It reflects off of your corneas, and that can be detected by sensors in real time. So you go through a calibration process, you sit down and you watch a dot go and move across the screen, and then the software is able to use some image processing methods to find your point of gaze, which is the X and Y pixel coordinates on the screen, and how that changes over time at millisecond level precision. And so the software also has a lot of ways to analyze that data. You can get an eye gaze replay video of what people were looking at. You can get hotspot images of where they spent more time. You can define areas of interest, different regions of the screen, and then look at the total fixation time or duration that people were looking in those different regions. So there's a lot of different ways to look at this data. So in this study, we had 40 undergraduate students who had just completed an introductory physics class, and we had 13 graduate students who had recently served as TAs for undergraduate physics classes to serve as like our experts and novices. This took place at the University of Illinois. So we designed 42 different graph questions for them to look at, similar to the one that you see here. The reason we had so many is that we wanted to carefully manipulate the different aspects and features of these questions and kind of try and counterbalance that a little bit. So what you can see here is they were displayed some text that they had to read, and like the magnitude of the acceleration is increasing. And then they had to select which region of that graph, 1, 2, 3, or 4, by pressing a key. Did they think best match that text description of the motion? So in this particular question, the correct answer is region 2 because the line is getting farther away from 0. But that you can see that the shape of that graph is sort of inconsistent with the word increasing. So half of the items were like this one, where the shape of the graph did not match the word that was describing it in the correct answer region. I call that incongruent. Half of the items were congruent items where it did match. So we could manipulate the word that was being used. We could manipulate the axis, so you could have position, velocity, or acceleration in that graph, and which means that the relationship between the word that was in the text and that graph could be a direct relationship like this one, could be slope, or you could need to look at the area under the curve. If they pressed 5, it meant that they thought there was no region that met that, or maybe multiple regions that met that. And in this one, you could see I would call it an incongruent item. But a high number of students in this particular question picked region 4. A sample slope question you can see is this is another incongruent one. It's asking about velocity, but it's a position versus time graph. And the correct answer was region 4 because the slope is getting steeper in that region, but it's inconsistent with the word increasing. And more than half of the novices selected region 1, even though that's a constant velocity motion region. All right, so when we look at the performance across all 42 items, we do see some differences between experts and novices on the incongruent items, where the shape of the graph was inconsistent with the correct answer region, but not on the congruent items. They both scored pretty high on those items. When we look at the, comparing the direct slope and area types of questions, We see some differences for direct and slope, but both groups really seem to struggle with that area. What we see is on the congruent items, the scores are pretty clustered up towards the top for both groups. However, when we look at the distribution for the incongruent items, we see that there's a much wider spread for the novices. So some of them are up here performing like the experts are in red, but some of them are performing much lower. So there's just a much wider spread in the novices. So I've been spinning my wheels, like trying to figure out how do I look at, the total time in each region, and in addition to the pattern or the order in which people are looking at things. And so I've been investigating with Gantt charts. The only challenge is you have to look at an individual person's data for an individual question. And so you can see here that this is going to show you kind of a pattern of what they looked at. They looked first at the text and they cycled between regions 1 through 4, kind of deciding on an answer. So experts who answer correctly in general just look at the text region for just a short amount of time and then kind of cycle through the other different regions in order until they decide on an answer. An expert who gets it incorrect, the time scale is different on this one. They spent a lot more time on it, but they're just sort of looking and looking and looking. Maybe they have something in particular they're looking for, but they don't know what to answer. Novices who get it correct kind of also do this cycling, but they go back to the text again more frequently than the experts did. When you look at incorrect novices, it's a little more sporadic, and they tend to spend a little less time in the correct answer region 2, a little bit more time in that incorrect novice like region 4. They also go back to the text more than the experts do. But another thing to note is that correct novices spent about twice as much time viewing the question as incorrect novices did. So we've also started looking at the different audio explanations for these. And so this is a lot to interpret on this slide, I understand, but this is showing you the proportion of novices and experts who picked that region. So only 18% of novices picked the correct answer region 2 here, and you can see that most of them, about half of them, had the same reasoning as a lot of the experts who picked that region, that is where the acceleration was getting farther from 0 or more negative. Some of them just talked about how the magnitude is always positive. The novices sometimes tend to give very sparse reasoning, and so they talk about how, well, that's where the acceleration is increasing, which was just what the question was, where is it increasing? Since so many of the novices picked region 4, you can see that a lot of them were talking about slope, greatest slope, positive slope, increasing slope. Some of them also just repeated the question or had some other reasonings. There was maybe only one or two, I think it was 2 experts who got this one incorrect, and they were all talking about how it's increasing because it's getting less negative. So the way that they were interpreting increasing was to become less negative. And there were just a couple of people who were saying that it was all regions since magnitude is always positive, or it was increasing in multiple regions. All right, so what do we make of this data? So I think in general, like eye tracking is really interesting. You can get some really, I think it has a lot of potential. But the issue is that you get many different sources of data. There's a lot of data there because it's at millisecond level precision, and you have to figure out what you're going to focus on. So in general, we've looked at more than just this single question, but we see some differences in expert novice performance for those incongruent items when the shape of the graph is inconsistent with the word that's being described on the text. We also see for direct and slope items, there's a bigger difference between experts and novices than with the questions asking about area under the curve. We're also kind of noticing that there are different interpretations of the word displacement. We meant for it to be change in position in a region, but some people interpret that differently or maybe confusing it with distance. In terms of the order and the pattern in which they're looking at things, experts seem to have, they just read through the text once and then sort of cycle through the regions and make a decision, whereas the novices frequently go back and forth between the text and the different regions. But the novices who get it right tend to spend more time reading a question. So the audio explanations, vary a lot by question. So I think that there is some evidence that they're focusing more on the shape of the graph. We know from research on conceptual difficulties that students struggle with interpreting negative regions of a graph, and so we see that in many of our questions as well. So we've started to look at a lot more questions in detail, and so that's where we're heading in the future, is to see if these patterns hold true for additional questions.